Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit. I am so honored to be sharing this conversation with Xenia Viray of Myths of Creation. It is such a deep psychedelic conversation. We talked about essentially all of the things that matter. We really started with when I asked Xenia if there was a specific topic that she wanted to talk about, she mentioned this idea of talking about the right and the left brain. And after kind of sitting with this idea, it became clear to me that this is one of those topics that can really point out so much about how we see the world and the construction of our reality, and perhaps other ways to construct new realities. And it's such a rich conversation. I feel like this conversation is not a casual podcast episode. It truly is like a masterclass. And there's a sense that I have that this is just kind of what happens in Xenia's presence in general. I've known her for quite some time now. I've been in a couple of her courses and workshops. I'm currently working one-on-one with her. And from, the perspective of Jonathan, something that I just deeply, deeply admire about Xenia is that there are a couple things among many. One is the ways in which she really shows up and is not afraid of allowing her work to be kind of the singular, very individualized body of work that it is. Like, there's a sense when I listen to Xenia that it's very clear that this is her life's work and that she's just so unapologetically herself, and she sees the world in a very specific and enriching ways. And another thing that I really admire is the kind of innocence that she allows herself to show up in, because there's a kind of vulnerability, right, to showing up in that almost like childlike way. And this is something that you probably will sense right away if you go to Xenia's Instagram page. Her handle is @mythsofcreation. It's so funny because I never thought that I would ever introduce someone by saying how beautiful their Instagram account is, but truly, I feel like Xenia has turned her Instagram account into art. Like, there's something so breathtaking about how she approaches the space on an energetic as well as on a mundane level. So I can just wax poetic here about Xenia and her work all day long, but let's get to the conversation. And before that, let me read you Xenia's bio. Xenia Marie Ross Viray, she/they, is an imagination healer, frequency artist, and creativity catalyst with a focus on experiential learning containers and writing. She is the eldest of 3 sisters, and her name means kindness to strangers. Born as a brick-and-mortar fashion business, Myths of Creation, the name of Xenia's collective body of work, is a container for experiments, art, writing, and gatherings at the intersection of creativity, spirituality, and meaning-making. Xenia's work reconnects communities, ideas, and art forms that are traditionally siloed to enrich the pool of imaginal possibility. Her offerings are designed to help spirited innovators anchor their natural genius into form and include Imaginal Temple, a creative mystical mentorship, the Garden of Imaginal Substack, and an evolving cornucopia of courses, workshops, and one-on-one sessions, which you can find at mythsofcreation.com and at Myths of Creation on Instagram. All right, here's my conversation with Xenia Viray. Welcome, Xenia, to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I think what you offer and who you are in this world is just so rich, Xenia. Like, there's so much multidimensional weaving that you do. Your Instagram is amazing. All of your courses are amazing. I'm currently working one-on-one with you, and it's like completely blowing my world open. Whenever I tune into your work, I feel this really beautiful abundance of like inspiration, intellectual curiosity, and also like a deep commitment to like continuing to center the heart. And so, yeah, I want to maybe give a little bit of space for you to introduce yourself, if you would like, in whatever ways feel right to you at this moment.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. It's so good to be here, and I'm really, really excited that our connection has woven in its many ways over time. Thank you for that beautiful reflection of what you see and experience in my work. Right now, the way that I like to describe my work is under the umbrella of imagination healing.
Mm,
And I really like to play with what is at the intersection of mysticism, creativity, and science, or the way we organize our thoughts, the way we organize our brains and construct the world. And if I braid with those three strings, it seems like some infinite amount of options are available.
mhm,
So right now, I'm just focusing on whatever those three vibrations want to do through me. And I'm really inspired by, called to, and activated by the idea of igniting and catalyzing other people's creativity, but in ways that redefine what creativity is
mm,
for people.
mhm,
So, yeah, that's loosely what I do. I definitely weave in storytelling, sometimes astrology or human design, but what ends up happening is usually a much more nebulous collage of this place where the intellect meets imagination.
mm. Wow, I love that. And I want to pause in that little phrase at the end where you mentioned where intellect meets imagination. Because to me, this is what kind of brought us together in this conversation. The topic that you were proposing for the conversation was this idea of the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And to me, this is such a rich topic because I know this was such a popular, like, there was a popularized version of this that basically says the left brain is responsible for, or the left hemisphere of the brain is responsible for analytical processes, right? Or like math, language. And then the right brain is creativity, right? And since then, like, I think this idea was popular in the 70s or so. Scientists have learned that that's not really the case because when it comes to intuition or when it comes to reason, all parts of the brain are lit up. And yet, there's also still something about this idea of maybe the more left hemisphere of the brain orientation to looking at the world and the right hemisphere. So, yeah, I just kind of want to open it up for you and see what wants to be shared here. Maybe starting with some like basic definitions of of how you understand this concept.
Yeah, so I have been watching the same talk on this conversation for about 8 years. It's
Mm.
a very short talk that is an abbreviation of a book by a psychiatrist named Dr. Ian McGilchrist. And what he talks about is that our brain, yes, it is divided. Like he's looking at the structure of it and asking, why is it this way? Why are the hemispheres not symmetrical? Why is there a division in the center? What is the purpose of this structure? And something he says is that because scientists discovered there wasn't a clean separation of reason goes in the left and imagination goes in the right hemisphere, scientists completely gave up on the narrative because of the nuance
Mm.
that was required. They decided to throw out the whole entire conversation. And I'm bringing that up because I think that happens a lot today, where in an effort to not go into extremes and or the disappointment of something really linear not being true all the time, we just give up
Mm.
on an idea or a line of questioning entirely. And so this particular talk is focused on how we can keep up the question of why the brain is structured as it is without falling into the trap of oversimplifying or creating false narratives in our desire to find definition.
Mhm.
And very loosely, he talks about the fact that the left brain, which rules the right side of the body, is the part of us that understands how to focus our attention on the known. So when we know something is already important, that part of our brain is really good at manipulating abstractions to better understand the world, to change the world, to create systems in the world. And what I think is so fascinating about that is that he says, in order to be so efficient, that left brain has to make a simplified model of reality that just shows you what is relevant, what we know to be relevant.
Mhm.
And then he talks about the right brain being the part of us that has a very broad attention, that is looking for what we don't know yet. It's looking in the broad lateral vision for surprise. It understands that there may be something in the field that we don't recognize
Mm.
and is always openly curious about that. And it's also the part of the brain that understands embodiedness, individuality, and metaphor as
Mm.
well. So we can think about it as where our intuition and where our desire to relate without grasping
Mhm.
lives.
Mhm. Wow. I love that last piece you brought in about desire to relate without grasping. Yeah, I can definitely see, even in my own lived experience, the ways in which there are those two modes, right? And it's like one thing I'm thinking about as you were speaking is, all these different ways that we live within a culture that really prizes the left brain's way of looking at the world, right? Like we have created a whole civilization where we can classify things, where we can put things into formula, and there's maybe a lack of skillfulness or harnessing around the idea of what happens when we think ecosystemically, right? What happens when we kind of look at everything as part of being related to the larger context in which it's kind of operating within. Hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting because the other thing about very specifically about the right brain is that it is where we understand interconnectedness and
Hmm.
context. And I feel like what you're describing in our current culture is this love of classification. It gives our brain this little like hit of dopamine that makes us go, I understand this fully. There's
Yeah.
nothing else here to uncover.
Right.
Whereas the other part of our brain is like in a relational dynamic, everything is always moving.
Mm.
It
Mhm.
never stops moving. And there's no category. Every individual is like their own microverse.
Mm.
So I have to stay really broadly curious, or I will never get to drink the nectar of the experience of trying to understand a puzzle I'm never going to solve.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, I love this because it's bringing me to the first offering that I engage with from kind of your platter of um, courses and like resources, which is create your cosmology. Um, and I want to hear you speak more about this idea of every individual is a microverse. And to me, as I'm hearing that, it makes me think about like the ways in which specifically kind of Eurocentric or Western ways of thinking sometimes eradicates like we're so even I'm thinking about statistics, right? And like the ways that as someone who was trained in statistics, we were taught to really kind of see the pattern, right? We were taught to see what the mean is or like the median is, right? But we are taught to eliminate the outliers when actually when we think about us as individuals, often what makes relationships interesting between two individuals aren't always these common denominators, but like the ways in which we are different, right? Or like even sometimes the same concept can land so differently in my body because of my lived experience versus your body because of your lived experience. So I'm curious to hear more about this idea of every individual being a microverse and maybe even why you are interested in this idea and exploring this idea in your work.
Hmm. I don't know if this is self-centered, but I spend a great deal of time trying to understand myself since I was very young.
Mm.
I was really into like different personality tests, and I love astrology, and all the things that we can use to investigate ourselves. I've always been drawn to. And I think that a lot of the I don't want to call it illness. It's more like calcification where there could be growth in our relationships, within our own experience, in our world at large, comes from this desire to understand ourselves in the eyes of systems that cause us to delete the outliers, like
Mm.
the parts of us that don't fit neatly into anything, the parts of us we don't understand yet. And I feel like part of being in a world full of categories or in a world that's so left brain is thinking that a feeling of graspability equals non threatening, equals safety, equals mastery. And a
Mm.
feeling of ungraspability equals danger, equals threat, equals scary. And I think that my relationship with myself and the world around me was woven around these narratives of like, if I can't understand this, if I can't become my own sole purpose career counselor and just give myself a score and tell myself where to go, I'm going to fail. I'm going
Mhm.
to fail at life.
Mm.
And I'm actually getting really emotional as I talk about this because I believe so strongly, so strongly that some people are not here to adapt to the world as it is, and that it's deeply painful to
Mm.
feel that sensation.
Mhm.
Um, because you want to relate to other people and relate to yourself. because they have to sort of feel no choice but to create a space for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And in the absence of courage, sometimes there's just circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel like life really pushed me to see everything I was trying to grasp as actually this really fertile, beautiful space after trying to sort of make those outliers the weeds in my garden for a long time. I
Mm-hmm.
was just trying to like yank them out so I could be a sort of beautiful that other people could perceive
Mm.
instead of just letting them grow.
Mm-hmm.
And I see so much beauty in the way people operate. It is so clear to me that when they don't see it, it's painful for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's my main drive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that with us. That's so I feel it in my heart as you were speaking about it. And it's making me think about how, in my own experience too, it feels like one of the biggest lessons that I got from doing kind of one on one work with people is witnessing my own ability to see other people's radiance in all of the ways that don't fit within the existing template, you know? And after, like, I don't know, client number 200, I started realizing, why do I not apply that way of looking at the world into myself? Like, I wonder if you had that experience too of having that gift, right, of being able to see the potential, and maybe not even the potential, but like the beauty that's already there for other people, and then eventually the deepest lesson, like, is that you need to apply that to yourself. Has that been part of your experience too?
Definitely. That's
Mm-hmm.
definitely been part of my experience. I feel like it's probably quite common. I want to say universal, but that sounds a little too strong, but it's probably pretty common. But I think that one of the things I notice, especially for people who work in the realm of like spiritual questions and
Mm-hmm.
metaphysical questions, is that we have walked into a field of symbols, words, and ways that have been used so much that they don't mean anything anymore. One of them being like, love yourself first, or like, if you can't love yourself first, then no one else won't be able to receive love from other people, or all these kinds of abstract words. They're just words we hear over and over again. And for better or for worse, the reason some of these things stick around is because they are true. But the reason we tune them out is because they're said with so much superficiality. They've been on too many mugs and t-shirts. We've seen them in a context that's actually pretty uncaring.
Mm.
And I feel like the concept of what it means to honor ourselves is actually very foreign for most people all over the world. And I think that is because our constructed world that we've been talking about, this kind of left brain world of categories and definitions and values based on numbers, it's kind of teaches us to assess our value based on something extremely external and something that someone else determines, essentially, not
Mm-hmm.
us,
Mm-hmm.
someone else. And so I feel like it's actually a lot of work to figure out what that means for each of us. Like, what does it mean to know who you are, or honor yourself, or value yourself?
Mm.
And I think it's easier when we look at other people because we don't have this heavy consequence to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. it's also making me think about like neural pathways, and the ways in which I think one of the maybe functions of being human is that we created these little like templates for ourselves for like moving through the world, right? I'm thinking specifically about my training as a musician. Like there's a way in which in order for me to play a certain passage at the piano or like sing a certain um, melody in my voice, I've had to kind of create like this is how I'm going to get from this place to this place to this place, right? Like I've created kind of like an energetic or even somatic itinerary, right? And it's so hard to break away from that, right? Because we've kind of constructed our lives um, using these like tiny micro itineraries, of like, this is what you do, right? You wake up and you like take a shower and you do this, and I think after a while, a lot of these processes become so automatic. And I'm thinking also specifically about, like, for example, nowadays I hear a lot of conversations about how people who are not neurotypical, maybe have ADHD or something like that, have needed to like up the stakes in order for them to actually complete the work at hand, right? And I definitely see this within myself where if I don't have this huge looming deadline or like something is really at stake, I'm just kind of continuing to be in this like grid. Like I just get stuck and I can't seem to like move forward, and because of that, I've learned throughout my life that I needed to really make like big projects in order to make sure that they get done, or like I have to have these really scary deadlines for myself. Otherwise um I can't complete it. And I think there's something about that that's also true in this case, because in a way, I think a lot about the role of self hatred or like self criticism in terms of being a productive member of society, right? Like how that's been used as this mechanism in order to get us to work when we don't want to work, to produce when we don't want to produce, And I think what you were saying about us kind of adopting this template that's coming from outside is in some ways a way that we kind of outsource security, you know?
Yeah, that's so powerful what you're talking about. And you're reminding me that I have some bold statements coming through me right now. I'm just going to go with it.
Go for it.
So I've been facilitating this mentorship called Imaginal Temple. It's one-on-one or
Mhm,
in a group.
mhm,
And it's by far the most mysterious of the offerings I've ever held space for because we have to follow the spirit of the person's creativity. Like
mm,
you have to honor the spirit of that person's creativity. That's my whole job.
yeah.
And what I've noticed is that these templates are really useful, but there is a mass consciousness rebellion against templates and current templates. But what's happening for many of us is that we are so burnt out of the templates that we want to swing our pendulum in the other extreme and release a connection to the value of structure in general. We
Mm,
want to throw out everything because
mhm,
there's been so much sort of coercion and corruption woven through the files of those templates.
yeah.
And I feel like we are actually learning how to use them playfully instead of throw them away.
Mhm,
And it's our relationship to the template that needs repair,
yeah.
not the disposal of the template to be dominated by another aspect of us. We're
Mhm,
getting out of this sort of domination of one singular aspect of our personality internally in order to feel organized pattern that we have. Again, it's this need to simplify to understand. So it's
mm,
like, well, if I'm not structured, I'm unstructured.
Mhm.
And that's who I am. And I get the appeal for sure, but we've been talking a lot about in my group how even when you're in a state of rebellion, you have given away the creative director title to something outside of you because
Yeah.
it makes the first chess move, right?
Right.
And you're always reacting or responding. And I think our universal consciousness around creativity is in a great state of rebellion.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of the people right now are here to invent new templates after they get a break from and break down the relationship to templates that's been oppressing them. I feel like we're learning how does our creative spirit use these templates as a scaffolding or as a
Hmm.
foundation. And I feel like this anger at the part of me that did so well in school. I was a really good listener
Mm.
in a lot of ways, although my mother might say otherwise. But I really I found a lot of comfort in the we'll give you 7 options, choose a track, complete the steps on the track, and you get a sort of energetic cookie at the end. Like I
Hmm.
really liked that and thrived in that world.
Yeah.
So when I went into my first year out of school and realized I didn't know how to actually do anything without the options laid out for me, I was terrified.
Mm.
And I feel like this idea of feeling useless is really useful to the construct of getting people to value themselves for their labor, which then turns into their power to purchase,
Hmm.
then makes the idea of freedom being about being someone who can have the most options to consume.
Yeah.
And all of it is to fill this hole inside ourselves that you were talking about, which is, well, I can only motivate myself from seeing something wrong with myself. I have
Hmm.
to sort of earn my own respect either through these external systems or not. And I think that wound of, I mean, the simplest way of thinking of it is it's universally normal to think you are acting from a deficit every single day.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It's so wild to me. Yeah. It totally makes sense. It's also making me think about creativity, which is something you brought in earlier, and how so much of how we've defined creativity as a culture is very much actually rooted in this division, right, between the right brain and the left brain that we've also found extremely comforting to have, right? It's this idea of like creativity needs to look like quitting your job and being an artist, you know? Creativity needs to look like not having any structures at all in your day, right? And it's interesting. I think I'm currently in this moment of returning to things like having structure in my day, returning to um, even like long term planning, which is something I've resisted for a very long time now, like for at least the past 5 years, because I'm recognizing there is actually value in having that. Like in my, I'm going to make this very micro because we've been speaking very macro, Xenia, which is I've gone back to using my planner at the start of the week and literally spending not more than like 30 to 45 minutes of just plotting out everything that I need to do for the next week, right? And what I've done is actually back in the days I would execute it almost like a soldier, like really getting very very disciplined with myself. Like I have to start, like I have to go to gym at 4 o'clock, can't move, right? Like I have to set an alarm, you know. But nowadays I've experimented with what does it look like if on Sunday night or Monday morning I plot out the rest of my week and then I don't look at my planner. I just let myself run whatever my body wants to do, but there is this kind of mental awareness, right? Of like, these are the things you need to do. This is how much time you have to do it, but it's all kind of just running in the background. And it's been so liberating because in some ways I've discovered that maybe the point of having a plan and a planner is, you know, when I have like an hour break between two meetings, maybe like a month ago before I started this practice, I would just kind of float and I would not be doing anything. I would just be looking at Instagram, like scrolling, honestly. And now I'm like, okay, I have an hour. Let's look at that planner and see what I was supposed to do, right? I'm putting it in air quotes here and see if I want to do it, you know, or maybe I just want to go for a walk, right? But I wonder if maybe when we think about being a creative person, what we are really craving for is getting out of this binary way of looking at the world that's so prevalent in our reality, right? Like we want to step out of this binary of like good and bad, you know, organized or disorganized, and all of that, you know, productive, not productive, right? Yeah, what are your thoughts about this?
You know, I've actually started doing something similar not too long ago, so I find that interesting.
Hmm.
Um, One of the things I want to say is that I do think that there's something about a relationship with time that is connected to creativity. I feel like perhaps because we're talking about the left and right brain, there's this thing about time where when we try to construct something, we almost go into that left brain template and we get sort of excited about the potential of our productivity. I notice this with myself.
Hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
I will always overshoot what I think is possible times two, 100% of the time. I never
Yes.
adjust it. It can never be adjusted. And I feel like what you're talking about is understanding how to be playful with that space of the relationship between the left and right brain,
Hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
sort of starting to understand how you can even make the tasks that are seemingly organization or analytical based into something really experimental, like something playful,
Yeah.
and sort of weaving the energy between the hemispheres together. Because the other thing we didn't talk about is that the hemispheres have a part that actually divides them, that inhibits them. And I feel like when you have a little bit of a trickster energy where you're going to bring in the playful into the part of the day or the task that's supposed to be methodical, or you like play around with what it feels like to be methodical, doing something really abstract and silly, that there is a little bit of energetic alchemy that's happening there where you're really moving energy and around in a way that shakes up those rigid neural pathways you were talking about before.
Mm-hmm.
And when you really think about it, there's something really profound here about you bringing this down to the micro of time. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to our value, and how we understand ourselves through the lens of the part of us that can be understood analytically and the part of us that will never grasp.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like when you simplify it, it's about all those things. So at the end of the day, our relationship with time is our relationship to sort of our orientation towards life, what's important to us,
Mm-hmm.
what is worth our time, what is a way of orienting ourselves towards time that allows us to feel that sense of freedom you talked about.
Yeah.
And I do feel like this idea of time freedom as abundance is very much coming up for a lot of people right now.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this time freedom as abundance is a sort of resource, right? It's making me think about like flow states and how um, when top athletes or top musicians get into that flow state, it's almost like the way I always envision it, and this is definitely corroborated by my own experience and some of the kind of research and reports I've read about this, is in your brain, it feels like there's so much time to do all of the things, but from kind of an objective perspective out there, you're actually doing something really complex within a very, very short period of time, right? But there's a way in which, like, in the brain, it feels so expanded because there's this, like, really fluid pathways where things can happen. Like, for example, I'm thinking about, uh, uh, like a violinist who's like a virtuoso, right? Playing this really difficult passage. Like all of these notes, right? They were able to kind of hit accurately within a very short span of time. And there's kind of this double awareness of like one is very much rooted in the details and the other one is really looking at the big picture and both are kind of happening at the same time, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's reminding me of creativity as being in a receptive state, being a vessel for something much bigger than you, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think we're kind of talking about the right brain being the part that's very comfortable in the unknown, in the ungraspable, in the quote, something bigger than you.
Yeah.
And the left brain, knowing the notes, knowing the pattern, knowing the scales, having the muscle memory, having the structure, so that when you receive those big abstract senses, you can translate them more
Mm-hmm.
easily. You can not get so stuck in thinking about the technique that you can just receive the information. And
Mm-hmm.
as much as I love to be more of a free flowing person, I think there is a lot to be said about the value of practice because there's something about the muscle memory of being a vessel for creativity, whether it comes through playing a song over and over again, that allows the transcendent feeling of sort of merging with the thing that's bigger than you
Mm.
to be more comfortable, to be a place of relaxation instead
Yeah.
of a place of effort. Sort of reminds me of when I took these modern dance classes in college before I understood that's like literally the most expensive way to take beginners modern dance and don't recommend it to anyone unless you are actually studying that. Um, but I remember the teacher teaching us some choreography and then saying, okay, well, now we just marinate. We practice, 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 practice. And then there's a point of time where things have to marinate inside of you,
Mm.
just kind of
Mm-hmm.
weave into you where you're resting or passive. But you have to practice. Like, first, you have to allow the memory of that movement or that creative spirit to become at home inside of you
Yeah.
by learning its language,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like we're arriving at the heart of this conversation now, which is, something that I heard when you brought up this topic of like the left brain and the right brain, specifically in the context of mysticism, spirituality, creativity, is um, again to kind of bring back what you were mentioning earlier about these kind of platitudes, right, in the spiritual community. I've heard a lot of conversations around not using the thinking brain, right? That if you want to access your intuition, like leave your thinking brain at the door, you know? And I've also heard this other concept, which to me somehow feels similar, like energetically, they're kind of cousins of one another, which is leaving your personality at the door to be a vessel, right? So yeah, I kind of want to introduce these concepts and kind of hear more about your experience with them, what you're thinking about them. I feel like I have a lot of very strong opinions about these things, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, and specifically, um, in contrast to this idea that you're kind of introducing of intuition and creativity maybe being about the braiding of the left and the right brain, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, that's very interesting, what you're talking about in regards to intuition being leaving the mind behind or leaving the personality behind to become a vessel, because I spent a great deal of time thinking about if there is a such thing as objectivity. And we talk about this for a whole module in Create Your Cosmology because I wrestled with it for about a year, especially in 2020.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And this actually does remind me of the brain structure, because what makes us different than a lot of other creatures is our frontal lobe,
Mm.
which allows us to step back from the immediacy of everything, the being kind of pushed up against experience. And it allows us to create concepts around things. And this is what allows us to be inventive or strategic, but it also what allows us to be empathetic.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like when you talk about, leaving the thinking mind behind, it kind of, that platitude reminds me of trying to remove your frontal lobe, of trying to be a little animal. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's this assumption that that somehow is going to allow you to still translate those feelings and sensations into some kind of coherent thoughts or ideas or translation. And I do think that frontal lobe piece is about translation.
Mm.
I think it's a
Mm-hmm.
mechanism by which we translate sensation into something that we can share. And, you know, I think there's a beauty to felt experience that can't be described, but I heavily lean and favor the idea of translation, because think about this. For now, hundreds of years, people have been forced to live in a very mental field. To tell people that the faculty that makes them safest in this world, that they best understand, that they were taught to develop for most of their education, that they don't need everything to be translated to make sense to it, is actually lacking compassion. That's my opinion.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of deeply mystical, gifted friends who are really against the idea of over explaining. And for sure, I don't need anyone to explain to me a beautiful painting or a piece of music. I don't need that. I
Mm.
can feel it. I can look at
Mm-hmm.
the ocean, I can feel it.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're talking about certain kinds of spiritual perspectives, that we're trying to share a window through our own eyes to someone else to create a bridge there, trying to help their mind have a footpath towards the imaginal space we're leading them to is really, really, really generous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I do understand this value of feeling and sensing without the mind's interference. I think that's really interesting. But I don't think that we need to like put it on some silver platter as the most pure form of intuition, knowing, or mystical creation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, to the idea of putting your personality away, like I've come to the conclusion after a very long time of trying to understand objectivity, that objectivity is cultural.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if we want to if we think that we can remove our subjectivity, which is what I equate to personality, I think we're actually removing the thing that helps us see what no one else who's incarnate can see exactly the
Mm.
way we see it.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I kind of think that's part of our purpose is to see it through that window.
Hmm. Right. This is making me think about a couple things. One is this idea of objectivity being cultural. Um, it's making me think about ontology and about this idea of what's real and what's not real, right? And how, in some ways, we always interact with the world from the lens of a certain ontology. Like, we can't get out of it, right? Like, we're always choosing something, even when, that ontology is maybe like animism, right? Which is not the prevalent ontology in the West, right? Because in the West, this cup that's in front of me that I'm drinking out of is like this dead object. It's inanimate, right? But from the lens of animism, everything has spirit. Everything has uh, agency. Like matter has agency, right? Um, and it's really interesting thinking about even, I come from a largely animist culture. Like in Indonesia, people are largely animists, I would say, right? It's changed a lot in the last 20 years because of modernization and westernization, but um, people still believe that they can see ghosts. And it's not, relegated to um, like people with special abilities. Like you're just kind of like, yeah, of course, and there's a ghost right behind your house in that banana tree right there, right? Um, and it's making me think about like how that way of thinking is actually really objective for people who live outside of the normative Western framework, right? And um, it's like, yeah, of course, why can't you see that the grasses have spirits? Like, duh, right? Like, there's kind of that sense of, like, it doesn't even make sense that it would be otherwise, right? And then the other thing I'm thinking about is, oh, it's like leaving me right now. I'm just gonna pause there. I'm just gonna let that kind of sink in. Um, yeah, and see if you have anything that comes up for you around that.
Yeah, I really love what you've brought in here. This idea that from an animistic perspective, in an animistic culture, the objectivity is just to assume that there is a spirit in everything, because of course that makes sense. And what I feel like is kind of circling around is that the desire to find objectivity, the desire to find this most perfect lens, the desire to find the lens that is really most clean, most pure, most uncorrupted by us putting something onto it, is this kind of desire to find something right in disguise.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's just a really cleverly disguised agenda of finding a way of seeing the truth that somehow doesn't have the stain of human personality
Yeah.
on top of it,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And when we bring in the cultural, we start to see that it's a little bit of a trap to think this way, because if we believe that there is some kind of pure truth somewhere, and we look at the whole globe as a set of different cultural assumptions or unconscious beliefs, then we have to start to create this weird hierarchy between
Mm.
cultures.
Mhm. Yeah.
And we have to say, well, it's more pure to see it this way, or it's less pure to see it that way. And this is what I really think that the idea of braiding the hemispheres is trying to help us with, is to understand that there is a real beauty and bounty to being strategic. Like, what do you think happens when people gather food in certain parts of the season? Like,
Mm.
it's still a strategic way of behaving when you're working in sync with the cycles of the planet. Like, we don't
Yes.
have to create these weird mythologies that are all separated into corners in their pure form in order to know who we are.
Mm.
The truth is that each of us have this cornucopia of ideas that require us to use our whole brain.
Mm-hmm.
And as we are able to not identify with little tiny rooms of who we are as the the best or the most valued, we start to do the same for others.
Yeah.
We start to be able to see the value in all the ways people around us operate. And I think that it is this search for a feeling we can never be wrong,
Mm.
because it's very shameful
Mm-hmm.
to be wrong
Yeah.
in this day and age.
Yeah.
To not know everything is so dangerous right
Mm-hmm.
now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what could be worse atmosphere for learning than feeling like making a mistake or not knowing everything is dangerous.
Yeah.
And I think it's this secret fear that if we don't know everything, we will be thrown away,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
that drives us to take beautiful curiosities into the desire to force other people into our way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think a lot about this connection between right and wrong, and somehow how that's conflated with the experience of, or the value judgment of worthiness, and the experience of like feeling good or bad, you know? And it's so interesting, right? Again, because all of this to me is like binary thinking, right? It's like this, it's so densely packed, you know? And I don't think it's so funny because as someone who was born under a Gemini moon, I love thinking about right and wrong separate from worthiness and separate from good or bad, you know? Because there is something to be said. Like I learn a lot um from teachers or systems that give me clear delineations of like this is it or this is not it, right? And what I found to be so interesting, Xenia, for example, when I was teaching astrology, um almost like a year and a half ago now, is how deeply embedded it is in our nervous system, that when someone says, okay, that's not the right way to look at it, that it's a criticism of the self, right? And it's like, I didn't realize. I mean, I've always known, as someone who is always putting themselves in like educational spaces and is always learning, I always know that I carry intense educational trauma in my body. And I'm always actively like unwinding from that, finding new pathways, right? But I didn't fully appreciate the intensity of how that plays into our whole existence until I started teaching. And I saw it in my students, and how difficult it is to, for example, teach something like astrology and literally tell people, okay, that's wrong. Like the way you're looking at it is wrong. Let me show you the right way, and not have it feel or land as like a criticism of their beingness, you know? Because there's actually that they're separate, right? Like if I say, okay, you're using the technique the wrong way, that doesn't mean anything about you as a human being, right? In fact, like, isn't that why you signed up for this course? For me to tell you like how to do it, you know, in like the proper way. But it's so challenging, I think. And especially I think a lot about the cultural aspect of this too, where I feel like in the US, um, maybe this has to do with the culture, maybe this has to do with the government, but we are so afraid of being wrong for some reason. Like it's almost like apologies are very shameful, right?
Mm,
Um, like changing our minds is also something that's very much like frowned upon, right? There's something about how we define integrity as a culture and something about how we define uh, worthiness or authority as a culture that kind of makes things very, very convoluted. And in some ways, it's very difficult for people to learn, I think.
I think this is so interesting and important. Like when I was waitressing for years, I used to actually shut down whenever I realized I made a mistake. I
Mm-hmm.
would see, okay, I put the wrong thing in or forgot something. I can tell no one here. I got to figure this out very quietly and quickly on my own, which is just a clear imprint of how I dealt with that feeling as a child. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's like so
Mm-hmm.
obvious to me that I must have always been like, well, got a problem. Don't don't know who to I don't trust anyone to help me
Yeah.
because people find out I did this, the consequence is too big. This is
Mm-hmm.
like forgetting someone's sandwich in a really casual vegetarian restaurant in the early 2000s. You know, it's like not a big deal. But to my nervous system, it was a big deal
Right.
to the point where I would often make the situation worse and worse and worse, all alone in total isolation,
Mm.
because it was so scary to me to feel wrong or admit that I was wrong or confront someone that I made a mistake and
Mm-hmm.
let them know. And I feel like what you're actually touching upon is this universal, it's not universal, it's definitely felt by some people more than others, but this very common sense feeling that we cannot survive the sensation of shame,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
that if people see something different than what we hope or want to project, if we lose control of that projection, we will literally be outcast.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning about throwing out the outliers, about the templates of creativity are the new templates of creativity that I think are emerging have to do with taking the parts of us that have been devalued, judged, suppressed, oppressed, or controlled and asking them what they actually have to teach us. And I feel like in order to really invent the new, which is really what the right brain is about, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this is valuable yet, but I'm curious about it. I'm really not sure. There's something here implicit, I feel, is actually trusting a path where there's no way around making mistakes, being misunderstood, because like the shape of what you're trying to make or who you are is for sure unrecognizable by many.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's actually what you're trying to create is something unrecognizable, something unfamiliar.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love what you're bringing up because it all goes back to not throwing out the baby with the bathwater idea. Like sometimes maybe it's great for us to embrace technique and understand that some things are wrong on this very like base level
Mm-hmm.
and learning to untangle that from the part of us that it wants to play in territories that are just considered wrong or considered strange, but not actually wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I was really struck when you said something about surviving the sense of shame and also, or the sensation of shame, and also about this idea of losing the control of projection. And it's making me think about how creativity and experimentation, I don't know if I would go as far as say that there are enemies to creativity and experimentation, but I would definitely say there are challenges, right, to like creativity and experimentation. And I would say one of the challenges that I've become so aware of in the past couple months is this idea of how when we're trying to control that projection and how other people see us and like protect ourselves from the sense of like other people seeing something that we don't want to see, there's so much energy going there that for me personally, I have a really hard time just kind of letting my creativity flow through me and letting myself be in that experimentation mode because I think there's an inherent rigidity to protecting ourselves from shame and also not losing control of the projection that makes the more fluid way of being necessary for us to feel in flow and to feel creative, um, from like actually being able to access that, right? Um, so yeah, I guess I would love to hear you talk more about this.
So, what this is really something major in the collective right now, at least from my
Mm,
experience with the people I work with and the people I talk to.
mhm.
And this is because social media has made the art critic microphone now belong to everyone. And it's also a great tool for building community and building bridges. And I am definitely one who's grateful, really,
Mm,
for social media in a lot of different ways. But all of a sudden, the reaction or response to anything or share you do is immediate and invited. And the norm is to feel like to be relevant, there needs to be that response or that reaction, or there's some kind of measurement.
yeah.
But with what you're saying around the energy of that goes towards that, I do find many of my most creative students, clients, and friends are held up the most by being much too aware of how any thought they share can be categorized and tracked by that very left brain part of us by narrative stories and ideas that are out there in the public through different authority figures. And so, for example, it's very, very common that somebody reads, if you use these words or say these particular words, you are exactly this kind of person through the
Hmm.
lens of X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of beauty in trying to learn and from people who are excel in their amount of knowledge or the amount of experience they have in a certain topic. But there is this feeling of needing to demonstrate how much we know to each other in this really public way, where it almost feels like if you say something that makes it clear that you don't follow this person or you don't read this book, you're going to out yourself. You're going to
Mm,
out yourself because it's just going to be clear if you express from your heart all the things you haven't read, all the things you haven't woven into this. And so we're coming from this
mm,
deficiency place,
yeah. Right.
like, and I think that it's not all quote bad because I think a lot of that comes from a desire to do better and be
Hmm.
better by each other.
Hmm.
Um, and that's ultimately a beautiful instinct. But when it comes to people who are here to catalyze something that's absolutely coming from honestly like a field of understanding in their soul that unites all the parts of them in such a cohesive way that they have to trust a process that is really more about that flow state you were talking about.
Hmm.
Hearing all those potential comments and critics while you're in the part of the project where you're trying to create or birth or tap in, it really does. It you can almost picture all the fuel in your body being committed or deposited into another area of your consciousness
Hmm.
that has nothing to do with what you're trying to create. And so I feel like what you're talking about is like the safety required for the whole part of our brain, our consciousness, our spirit, ourselves to feel in cohesion. Like, what
Mm,
is the safety that's required there? And I'm going to leave it there, although I do have another little story I kind of want to tell you.
I would love to hear that story, actually.
Okay. So, when I was doing Create Your Cosmology, when I was making that course, which was by far sort of the most me thing I had ever
Hmm.
put out in the world up until that time,
Hmm.
I was trying to understand the hemispheres of the brain.
Mm.
And I think I even told you all about this in that course.
Mm.
And there was this thing that would always happen to me after I would do a lot of research and a lot of study and a lot of intellectual thinking, where I would just know that that part of me needed to shut down.
Mm.
And I would walk off into the world and go do something else to entertain myself or just get my mind off of it. And with this particular thing, I decided to tune into this program on Gaia TV, like a random episode, which is this kind of like spiritual website. I am hesitating to say this, but some people would call it like super new age. So I'm just going to say it.
Yeah.
Um, so I was just taking a break and I tapped into a TV show, and there was a woman sharing her story about talking to angels.
Mm.
And I'm listening to her talk about her new book about angels and how she's teaching this visualization on something called the purple door, which is a metaphor for the crown chakra. And then she goes to channel the angels, and the angels say that the corpus callosum, the part of the brain that divides the right and left hemisphere, is what the actual purple door is.
Mm.
The door that creates the sense of peace or unity or connection to something bigger than you. And
Mhm.
I'm sitting there watching this, like, what is this hologram I'm living inside? How does life actually work? Like, really in control of here. Who else is here with me? Because I'm not doing
Mhm.
this by myself. There's no
Mhm.
way.
Mhm.
We're so interconnected that I took time away from sort of the part of me that could consciously learn a skill, and something else just emerged out of the field. But the only
Mhm.
way I would let myself get to that place was complete exhaustion. That's when I
Mm.
opened that door.
Yeah.
And, you know, all this to say that I feel like there is a real, you talked about it as educational trauma, but I think it's much bigger than that.
Mm. Say
I
more.
think it's like you were talking about the experience of having your energy trying to be entrained in a certain shape by a system that told you what was valuable and what was not valuable,
Mhm. Mhm.
and really working hard to entrain yourself to that shape. And then one day learning this is not actually healthy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And isn't that sort of the mechanism of so many other value systems that are alive in our culture?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I feel like my brain is firing off in like millions of different directions. But what feels alive in this moment is I also want to tell you a story, Xenia, which is a couple days ago, I was at the park here in Brooklyn with my partner, and we were looking at these two like wild geese with their children. I don't really know what to call it. Like baby geese is what we've been calling them. And there were humans all around, right? Like we were just like running, and there were people running, there were people just kind of passing by, and everybody was like, oh my God, look at the babies. They are so cute, right? And it's making me, and then my partner said something that really struck me, which was he said something about how, um, I don't remember the exact words, but he said something along the lines of how we can't coexist with nature. Like we're kind of taking over their home or something like that. And then I was like, really? It made me pause and I thought about it and I was like, I don't believe that to be true. And I think that when we look at the history of mankind, what really kind of juts out, is like if we look at the ancient world, we think about tribalism. And then when we look at our current modern world, we think about colonialism and coloniality. But I do think that there is another path, which is just respect, Like you can just be anywhere in the world, learn as much as you can about the people and the beings that are there, and then be respectful, you know? And ask these people and these beings what it means to them for you to be respectful, right? Knowing that you are a guest. And for some reason, I was really thinking about you and about this conversation we're about to have today because I think a lot about how, similar to that idea, right, of trying to control that projection or trying to conform to this system that tells us what's right and what's wrong, what it means to be worthy and not be worthy of protection and basic dignity, there is kind of this alternative that somehow as humans have been really challenging for us, which is just be a good human being. And I do think a lot about what it means to spend our energy not necessarily trying to fight all the ills of the world, but actually spending our precious life force cultivating this way of being. And this is something I've heard you talk about because your name, and this is often how you introduce yourself in spaces, means kindness to strangers, and it makes me think too about like even my experience moving to the US, where as someone who found it kind of challenging to live where I was born and where I grew up, I did find a certain kind of warmth to people in the US that I think often gets lost in this conversation, right? That we now are having about social justice and about the ills that the US is creating in the world, which are all true, by the way, right? Um, yeah, I'm going to pause there. I don't know if I have a question there, but I just kind of wanted to share that with you because I thought about you. And I do think that this is also touching on a topic we were kind of, we've talked about kind of behind closed doors or off records about collectivism and individualism. And I know we're kind of getting to the end of our time here, but I'm curious what's coming up for you in this moment.
Yeah, I really love what you're saying because I feel like what you're speaking to is actually the heart and a little bit about, you know, the the right brain as well, which is this feeling that I think we're trying to be better people through the mind,
Yeah.
and it creates this desire to conform to other people's languages and perspectives in order to let them know we're good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really something we do from a good impulse most of the time. I don't think that's something that comes from a bad place most of the time. But it's just going to recreate the same thing over
Mm-hmm.
and over again because we have to give our truth and honesty, and we have to give someone else the responsibility of deciding what's right and true, which is
Mm-hmm.
ultimately unfair to that person, whoever we've designated as that person, right? And I feel like how this connects to your story is somebody's immediate uh, sort of knee jerk reaction to the idea of being one with nature might be to look up different indigenous perspectives on being one with nature. And
Yeah.
then realizing, oh, well, all the different indigenous perspectives have some things universal, but they all have some things that are really different as well. And now what do I do?
Mm.
Ambiguity never goes away. But
Mhm.
what we can actually rely on is our feelings and sensory impressions on our relationship with someone else which is what you're referring to me at least, when you say respect.
Mm.
Because who's going to say that I'm being respectful?
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to determine that?
Mm-hmm.
That's such a broad question, but at the same time, you can feel it
Yeah.
when someone is getting something quote unquote wrong. And sometimes I've even seen people do things that could be considered egregiously offensive, but I look at them and I'm like, they are really trying to understand and respect this space. Something is missing them.
Mm.
Something is missing them right now.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, that basic feeling of respect, I think what you're getting to is that it puts so much responsibility in your sense. It gives you so much power, and the other so much power, not some overarching construct outside of you, but you and the other, that power to
Mm-hmm.
relate.
Yeah.
And that's what's been so missing from our education or our cultural framework, is that
Yeah.
relational intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
that knowing how to wield and own your power over making meaning, over creating relationships and making decisions. So that's like one thing I really want to say in response. And then the other thing around the individual versus collective, because I feel like we're kind of spiraling around this same concept, which is always finding the thing that we can carry out of the extreme or binary, and we can use it to weave with. We can find value there,
Mm-hmm.
not throw it away, but find value there. And I feel like what you're describing with the US and what we've both talked about with collectivism and individualism is that we have this desire to just want to paint everybody in these flat, broad strokes.
Mm-hmm.
All Americans are, all New Yorkers are,
Yeah.
all immigrants are. And I think that we both come from collectivistic cultures, right? And something I learned is that collectivistic cultures prize relationships above all,
Mm-hmm.
and that they tend to communicate really indirectly to avoid anyone having to say no to someone
Yeah.
else, which I've experienced in my family,
Right.
to protect people from the sense of shame. And actually, collective societies experience more shame than guilt, because it's a feeling that you've done something wrong in relationship to your group identity, whereas guilt is about your sense of your relationship to yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
so what you and I have talked about is how toxic individualism is very clearly in the Western mind as a topic, but
Yeah.
nobody talks about toxic collectivism,
No. It's
because
true.
that is not the experience they have here. And
Mm-hmm.
toxic collectivism is when you value a relationship above yourself. To disagree is actually seen as disrespectful in
Right.
certain forms of culture.
Right.
And for those of us who are in our community, that betrayal to the self, that dishonoring of the self, actually hurts the collective,
Mm-hmm.
because when we look at nature, everything serves the whole by being what it is.
Yeah.
And all these templates we've been talking about have been us participating in a collective imagination that doesn't trust what one is or know what one is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. With regards to toxic collectivism, I think a lot about the ways in which the collective also loses out on knowledge or like ways of seeing the world that can only emerge from allowing different people to have their own ways of looking at the world, right? There's yes, there's like shared language, there's maybe shared understanding, but I'm going to take that back actually. I think there's shared language, there's shared customs, But toxic collectivism can elude shared understanding because you can't really understand someone else without them being present, right? Their kind of authentic expression and emanation being there. One of my friends always like to say, I can't know you without you, which I think is such a beautiful and concise way to express it, because um yeah, there's something about toxic collectivism that prizes the mm, survival of the relationship so much to the point where it would rather let that be this like decaying, rotting thing rather than transform into like an alive, maybe new version of that relationship, right? Hmm.
Yeah, I love what you shared there because what I think I hope for is that when we kind of let ourselves think of everything that exists more like the microbiota in our bodies, where it's
Mm.
like, sure, there's good bacteria and bad bacteria, but it's all about the balance, and we mostly don't really know what's in there.
Yeah.
Scientifically, we can't even name it. There's this mystery. And if we keep insisting on things being familiar, then we keep being volunteers of our own ignorance,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And I love what your friend said. I think that is the thing that we sometimes forget is that when somebody shows you who they are and shares of themselves, even in a disagreement with you, ultimately it's because they value you knowing them.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah.
And that's really beautiful.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, Xenia, this has been incredible. I'm curious if there's anything else that you want to talk about that maybe I haven't touched on. Is there a question I should have asked or anything you kind of want to say as a final word before I have you share more about your work and your offerings to others?
You know, I think I just want to say this one thing about the word cosmology, which
Mm.
is the name of my course, Create Your Cosmology. Something I kept thinking about when I felt really lost in the binary world, trying to find a way, was that I kept noticing that in a lot of indigenous cultures, there's this cosmology, which is a full holistic picture of how a culture or society understands who they are and everything else that's in relation to them.
Mm.
And I really like this idea of looking for a whole that feels unified in some way. And I feel like if each person is a microverse, each person is also a cosmology, each
Mhm.
person has a perspective that is also whole in and of itself. And I guess I just wanted to bring that up to encourage people to think of themselves as an entire world, but also as an entire world view,
Mm. Mhm.
because I feel like everyone has so much to give. And through that doorway, you can find those things to give.
Yeah, so beautiful. Thank you, Xenia. Would you tell the listeners where they can find you? And yeah, any offerings you might want to highlight?
Sure. So you can find me on Instagram at mythsofcreation.com or at myths of creation.
Mhm.
And then my website is mythsofcreation.com. And I have a whole bunch of new work coming out, but what I'm most excited about is the second round of Create Your Cosmology
Ooh.
and also the workshop series that I create every season or so. The next one coming up is called Creation Portals.
Mm, awesome. I'm so excited. I feel like whenever I think about your offering, there's just this like fecund, abundant creativity kind of just oozing out. So, yeah, definitely encourage those listening to check out Xenia's offerings. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. This has been an incredible conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really delight in the feeling of sitting with you. So thank you.
Mm.